Good morning, everyone. The doors are closed. We've got the thumbs up. It's time to start. So welcome to those that are joining us online and also to those here in the building. If you didn't pick up an outline for today, there's a handout back on the Media Center. You're welcome to get one at any time. Won't bother me if you need to get up and go pick one up. As I mentioned last week, it's official. I am 1 week behind completely. I thought, I could probably make up some ground this week, and then we get the longest chapter in Ezekiel. Maybe not this week. So I will get us adjusted along the way. I'm just not sure where. So if you do still have your copy of the course outline, we're still following that structure. We're just a week off. So you can adjust accordingly, and I will tell you when that changes or something changes from that approach. So today we are going to pick up in chapter 15 and work our way through chapters 15 through 17. And when we get to 16, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I don't think I've ever used this approach before, but I'm going to try something just because it's such a long chapter. There's quite a bit in there that I want to at least highlight. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. And then we certainly can discuss questions people have. There's something unique about 16. Well, 15 through 17 collectively, we come to a trio of parables, if you will. That's why I've titled this section Parables and Pictures. In chapter 15, it's very short, it's only 8 verses. We'll read it here in just a minute or two. God likens Jerusalem to a vine, to a useless vine. So we'll look at the components there. It's got a really nice transition, 16, which is a very graphic description, poetic description of Israel's history, of their unfaithfulness to God. That's the focus. And we'll highlight that as we go through. And then chapter 17 is the parable of 2 eagles and a vine. Really, there's 2 vines in the story. But it focuses in particular on King Zedekiah, as we'll see with the explanation that's given in the chapter as well. So we will work our way through those. So let's start with chapter 15. If you want to turn over to Ezekiel 15, we're just going to read this one to get started. And then we'll have just a few comments about this section. I'm reading from the NIV this morning. If you're following along a different translation, you might see slightly different wording. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, how is the wood of a vine better than that of a branch on any of the trees in the forest? Is wood ever taken from it to make anything useful? Do they make pegs from it to hang things on? And after it is thrown on the fire as fuel, and the fire burns both ends and chars the middle, is it then useful for anything? If it was not useful for anything when it was whole, how much less can it be made into something useful when the fire has burned it and it is charred? Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, As I have given the wood of the vine among the trees of the forest as fuel for fire, so will I treat the people living in Jerusalem. I will set my face against them, although they have come out of the fire will yet consume them. And when I set my face against them, you will know that I am the Lord. I will make the land desolate because they have been unfaithful, declares the sovereign Lord. So we've got this basic question that God poses to Ezekiel. What good is the wood of a vine? It's not sturdy enough for woodworking. I use the example in the text of even making a peg. When you think about a peg, usually a peg's not very big, not very sturdy, not very circumference, much to it. And in these short verses, you've got really 2 kind of pictures going on. One, the question about the vine and the imagery that God is posing to Ezekiel, and then the application to the people of Israel. And again, if you just read this chapter alone by itself, you're really, what's this thing about a vine and these unfaithful people? But Ezekiel's been prophesying to these folks in exile for quite a while, and so they've been hearing the story or hearing the words, and this is a continuation of the message of the unfaithfulness of Jerusalem and the people in Jerusalem, people of Israel, and the coming destruction. So we have a continued picture of that and what's happening. But with the vine, the wood, it's really not good for anything. Basically, when you put it in the fire, it's even less useful. Once you've burned something up, that sort of makes sense. There's not much to it. And so what's the purpose? What's the purpose? Well, fuel for the fire. Okay, fuel for the fire. That's the good that the wood of a vine can serve, is to allow fuel so that you can have a fire. And so then he makes the application to Jerusalem. do with Israel. They'll be treated as fuel for fire. It's a really hard question, Richard. What's the fire God's referring to?
Tribulation.
What's that?
Tribulation.
Tribulation. I probably should have asked, who is the fire God's referring to?
You say God's a fire.
Yeah. Who's going to come in and destroy Jerusalem?
Oh,
Babylon, yeah. God doesn't make it that hard all the time. Okay. Babylon. And notice the wording, the way he said it. I'll set my face against them. Although they have come out of the fire, okay, the next time they won't. And there have actually been two instances. Okay, remember Babylon has come in the first time. You see, in established dominion, first group of exiles, including Daniel, was taken out. Came back the second time. The next group of exiles is taken out, and that included Ezekiel. The third time, destruction. The city will be ransacked and burned, as will be the temple. Okay, so that's what's coming. Again, this is the imagery that Ezekiel is telling to the people, that God is sharing with him, the message to give to the people. Again, remember the overall picture. Why are the exiles being told this? Settle in. Okay, you're not going back, at least not in a hurry. Okay, this is the consequence of the unfaithfulness they've demonstrated for so many years, many years throughout their history, which is a great transition as we get into chapter 16. Because chapter 16 is a total allegory parable, depending how you want to look at it, of Israel's unfaithfulness. Again, their idolatry. Keep that idea in mind, because we'll come back to it. We talked a little bit about it in class last week. Lee talked about it in the sermon last week. We're going to focus on it again, because this is the sin of the people. Our idolatry toward God. All right, chapter 16. It is the longest chapter in Ezekiel.
16,
yeah, there's outlines in the back. You're welcome to get one. Those of you coming in, if you haven't got one, please feel free to pick up one. That's fine. It won't bother me. They're back there on the media center, right in front of John. So chapter 16, longest chapter in the book. Lovely 63 verses. It's a chapter of prophetic poetry. It's a poetic description, most commentators describe it this way, of Israel's history. Referred to as prophetic poetry. Okay? He's telling the story, but there is a message about what's coming. As I mentioned, it's a review. Much of it's a review of the history of Israel and look at their future, but it's a look at their dealing with God. It's not a historical what happened here, there, and yonder. It's the relationship. How God entered into a relationship with them and Israel's response to that relationship, and then the consequence of their rejection of the covenant. Through the various readings, and I'll be honest, this is again one of those chapters I kind of got lost in over different times through the study, because there's quite a bit written about it, and a lot of it you don't need to read because it's all speculation about what they're trying to do. They're trying to match up this parable, the information in this story of Israel's history. Now, there's some elements that are that could be. It seems fairly obvious. But the point of this chapter is not to do that. It's not to be a historical recounting of their history. It's a recounting or an illustration of God's dealings with Israel. And then their conduct, and then ultimately the consequence of their conduct toward Him. And I say this now to point out when we get to, there's one section of this that's really awkward if you're trying to look at it as a historical account, because it just hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. And there's commentators galore that try to twist and figure, make it look right. Some of the same type of struggles people have with Revelation, trying to make it look into the future and what it will be. So that's not the point. The point is to look at God's dealing with His people, their response to that, and then the consequence of their unfaithfulness. So there's the synopsis. You've got it. Okay, we're all set. Now, to look at a brief outline of it, I know this part is not in your handout, but this is the kind of structure, the content that you'll see in chapter 16, in the opening verses. And we're not going to read through the entire chapter. I'm going to select out verses as we go through. And highlight some of these points to make sure you catch the imagery of what's here, to then get to the points where we can talk about their idolatry and then make some application to us today. But it begins very opening with the image of an infant. An infant that's exposed to the elements and just left to die. And then you have the rescuer coming along. The infant is nurtured and provided for. That provider is God, selecting and caring for this infant. This infant being, again, imagery, the people of Israel. God's made this people that he will form into a nation. The infant grows, matures, become a young woman, and then enters into a covenant or marriage relationship, again with God, grows and prospers. Now that growth and prosperity is due to the providence of God. Okay, the provider allowing for this, in this case, the young woman to mature and be very successful or to be very prosperous. But then she's unfaithful to the husband. And we'll see the characterization as the adulterous wife, which we've seen before in Ezekiel. Okay, the imagery is consistent throughout. And one of the things we've talked about with that imagery is the very personal nature of this failure, if you will, or of Israel's rejection of God, the way he characterizes it throughout the messages. And then the punishment for the sins. Okay, the consequence of that unfaithfulness, of that adultery, the relationships that, in this case, Israel has with other nations, with other gods, quote unquote. Then it closes on a note of hope, as we've seen again, consistency through the message. There's destruction, there's consequence for that unfaithfulness, but then there is a hope to come. And God, the husband, remembers the covenant, and we will return Israel, the wife, to the favored state. Okay. That's Ezekiel 16. Okay. All good? All set? You still should go home if you haven't read it and read the whole thing. We're gonna look through parts of it, or pull out particular verses. And what I'm going to do is a little bit different. Like I said earlier, I've never tried this before, and it may be a tremendous flop. Who knows? We'll see. But a way to get through a rather lengthy, kind of dense chapter with all the imagery. And I'm just going to highlight those points you saw through the scripture. And I've got them grouped so you can see how those topics, those elements lay out in the chapter if you've got the outline in front of you. You begin with Ezekiel's charge in the very opening of the chapter. God coming to him and giving him the word of this message this picture he's about to paint for him in the first two verses. And I'm going to read a couple of translations just to give us some contrast of terms of this opening verses. It says, again, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, make known to Jerusalem her abominations. Okay, that's one translation. Another one, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, confront Jerusalem with her detestable practices. Okay, two elements I just want to highlight. One, the abominations of the practices. Okay, they have been doing that which is very contrary to God. Okay, it's just completely opposing to him. And so he's going to point out what they've done that's been so terrible. But again, emphasize the idea of the illustration. Okay, the illustration that this is conveying. He says, confront Jerusalem. Okay, last time I checked historically, Jerusalem was a city. Okay, if you just read that sentence, think about that. How do you confront a city? A place? Does that make sense? It's not supposed to make sense in that context. It's not literal. It's not saying go and talk to the city, go talk to the walls, go talk to the buildings. That's not the way. Jerusalem is representative of Israel. Okay, confront his people. Okay, the city is symbolic of the nation, of the people that are still there. Because remember, the message is about the destruction of those that are still there, the city that still stands, of the temple that still stands. Okay, so he's giving this great imagery. Then the abandoned infant. Let's pick up in verse 4. On the day you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to make you clean, nor were you rubbed with salt or wrapped in cloths. No one looked on you with pity or had compassion enough to do any of these things for you. Rather, you were thrown out into the open field, for on the day you were born, you were despised. Again, the imagery of a nation that nobody wanted, a people that were of no regard. Okay, no one paid attention to. But then God steps into the picture. Okay, pick up in verse 6. Then I passed by and saw you kicking about in your blood, and as you lay there in your blood, I said to you, live. I made you grow like the plant of the field. You grew and developed and entered puberty. Your breasts had formed and your hair had grown, yet you were stark naked. The Lord provided for the child the nation which grew and developed. Okay? Taken care of by God. I should have also pointed out at the very beginning, and I apologize for not giving the advance warning, this is one of the most graphic chapters in the Bible as well. As God lays it out, he doesn't hold back. This is where it's at. You have this infant, wallowing in blood. Okay, the imagery. He wants them to create, he wants them to get the point that you are nothing. This group of people, there's nothing that they should be recognized, but God chose them. God brought them in, took care of them, provided and cared for them. Established a covenant with this group, this people, with this young woman in the illustration as she matured. Pick up in verse 8. Later I passed by, and when I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your naked body. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. If you read out the rest of those verses, the woman was washed, was cleansed, was adorned with clothing and jewelry, ate fine food, became beautiful, and rose to royalty. Okay? God provided for her. God brought about the growth and the prosperity for this nation. Okay? Making the point to Ezekiel to make to the exiles, this is because of his providence. Okay? He did this for them, prospered them, and then the rest of the chapter is about their response to God. Okay? So Israel's wickedness is illustrated through the majority of this chapter. Beginning with verse 15. But you trusted in your beauty and used your fame to become a prostitute. You lavished your favors on anyone who passed by, and your beauty became his. Again, the idea of the illicit affairs, of rejecting the husband, of rejecting that love relationship, that covenant relationship, and just going after others. Okay, looking for satisfactions. They set up high places, as we've talked about before. They used their riches that God provided for them to make idols. Read about this in Scripture, and Isaiah does it particularly well. You know, a piece of wood, you threw some of it in the fire, and then you went and took another part of it and made an idol out of it and started worshiping it. You know, just, you got us, we stop and wonder, what are these people thinking? You know, glad we would never do anything like that. Make idols out of stuff. Yeah, hold on to that. We're going to come back and step on our toes before we're done today. But he's, again, giving the imagery for Ezekiel to give to the people, this is what you did. Okay, this was your history. It gets a little bit worse. They presented offerings to other gods, okay, as they made idols. They set up those high places, those points of worship. And then does that which completely upsetting to God. Pick up in verse 20. You took your sons and daughters whom you bore to me and sacrificed them as food to the idols. Was your prostitution not enough? You slaughtered my children and sacrificed them to the idols. And it's one of those points we could literally say, okay, that actually did happen in Israel's history. Okay, we go back to the reign of Manasseh, they did sacrifice children. Again, not trying to pinpoint these things historically, that's not the emphasis. It's the imagery of how they treated their children. They were in a right relationship with the Lord. They were in a covenant relationship. God provided, prospered them. They went away. They taught their children. They followed the same examples. They destroyed their children by not maintaining that proper relationship with God. There's more. Okay, chapter 16. They did not remember God. And they're chasing after the other gods, after the other nations. They set up the public shrines. Verses 20 through 26 talks about their increasing promiscuity. References that with their prostitutions with the other nations. And just think historically, okay, those relationships with the other nations, particularly in times of trouble, when other enemies would be attacking Israel or Jerusalem in particular, they would try to make treaties, or they would make treaties with other nations, come and save us. Come and remember us. Come and help us. Instead of turning to God for their trust and hope. Looking around all to that which would not save them. And this is where the imagery gets kind of interesting. God says, unlike a prostitute who engages in that practice for a living, this is how a prostitute maintains a living, makes payment, you didn't even take payment, he says. Trying to convey to them this, I'm not sure what term to use, the despicable nature of their unfaithfulness. It's the total disregard. And as we said several weeks ago, when we started out this line of examples of messages, carry through the intimate nature of the relationship, or the intimate nature that should be in the relationship with God. For us, Think about the component, He indwells us. Can it get more intimate? Lee?
And the imagery of you had carried it off in the other direction, that if Israel had used this activity to become a great and prosperous nation on its own, then it's a different discussion with God. But that you did not even take that. You did all this and sold me out as your God and didn't get anything for it. You just got used by the other nations.
Exactly. And they're left in the same destitute position they were. You know, you didn't even prosper from it. That's a great point. And we get to the adulterous wife characterization. Pick up in verse 32. You adulterous wife, you prefer strangers to your own husband. All prostitutes receive gifts, but you give gifts to all your lovers, bribing them to come to you from everywhere for your illicit favors. So in your prostitution, you are the opposite of others. No one runs after you for your favors, you are the very opposite. For you give payment, and none is given to you. That idea, they're just used, either in forming relationships, or the enemies just come and take advantage of them, come and defeat them, because they have no hope, they have no support, because God has not provided them, because they've turned away, they've left Him. So all that wickedness will lead to judgment. That's where we pick up in kind of the latter part of the chapter. We're picking up in verse 35. So God's going to use these lovers, these other nations, to punish them. Okay? And as Lee described, that's in part they were already experiencing some of that in their dealings with them. Therefore, O prostitute, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God, because your lust was poured out and your nakedness uncovered in your whorings with your lovers and with all your abominable idols, and because of the blood of your children that you gave to them, therefore, behold, I will gather all your lovers with whom you took pleasure, all those you loved and all those you hated. I will gather them against you from every side and will uncover your nakedness to them, that they may see all your nakedness. And if you think back through the history, all of the enemies, the nations that came and attacked and defeated them. Okay, those periods of being enslaved because of their unfaithfulness to God. Okay, just recounting again in a very vivid way for them to get the point. Okay, these are not new messages. Okay, the people of Israel have heard this over their history from other prophets, but the intensity of it and the graphic description of it. This is really what your behavior is like to me. This is God telling me, this is how it feels to me. The betrayal after my care, my love for you, completely disregarded. And look what you've got from chasing after it. So, I'm going to give you over to them. They will use and abuse and destroy you. Pick up in verse 38. The judgment that's coming, the punishment, dies to their law. And I will judge you as women who commit adultery and shed blood are judged, and bring upon you the blood of wrath and jealousy. We got to know a little bit from their law, okay? This, again, illustrates the punishment that's coming. Anybody recall what's the punishment for adultery? Stoning. Put them to death. Same thing for the shedding of innocent blood. They were to be put to death. Okay, getting to the point, destruction. Okay, that is coming. I made this comment last week, and you're going to hear it again probably for the next few weeks. It sounds like God really keeps telling the same thing. He does. These exiles have got to get the message. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The temple is going to be destroyed. You will have nowhere to go back to for now. Settle in. Turn back. Okay, figure out that relationship with God. He's waiting. Okay, repent where you've been and come back. And then we will see the return. Okay, the remnant. It's the purpose of the punishment. Pick up in verse 41. They, this will be the foreign lovers, will burn down your houses and inflict punishment on you in the sight of many women. I will put a stop to your prostitution. I will put a stop to your prostitution, and you will no longer pay your lovers. Again, I haven't really spent much time thinking about it in this context. I'm about to say, if you think about, again, Israel's relationship with other nations and their welcoming nature. Go back to the period of the Kings, when Babylon first appears in the scene. They sent envoys to Jerusalem to learn about this nation, about these people. What are they really doing? Well, it's the point of those envoys coming to Jerusalem. That were welcomed with open arms and shown everything, shown the riches of this people. Spy them out. Okay? Prepared war. That's what Babylon was doing. They were taking over. They were defeating their nations around them. And they were welcomed with open arms into Jerusalem. So, I'm going to stop this. And again, the drastic action is needed to, again, get the attention. This has got to change. Remember we read last week in chapter 14, that imagery talked about the people in exile would be consoled regarding all the actions of God. And it wasn't the consolation with their brothers and sisters, their fellow Israelites. It was the consolation with God because of these actions he's taking. They're going to understand the justification, the rationale for it. Because remember, this last group that's going to come into exile, some of these will leave from that final destruction, may be brought to Babylon, and those already there, those already in exile, like Ezekiel and that group, will see them. And they're still wicked. They're still wicked. Even after the destruction, even after being defeated, even after being brought into exile. And those that will learn the lesson will realize, God was telling them, this is what's going to happen. You're going to see it. And then you'll know I'm the Lord. That is that path back. Because now God's wrath will subside. We pick up in verse 42. Then my wrath against you will subside. My jealous anger will turn away from you. I will be calm and no longer angry. So we're going to have a period of the exile where things are going to rest. God's going to let the land rest that they never let rest while they resided in Israel. And then at the right time, he will bring back that faithful remnant. Okay, picking up again in Ezekiel, verse 46. This next section, verses 46 through 58, or 46 through 58. This is the one I mentioned earlier. It's kind of odd if you're trying to do a historical recount, because it just doesn't make sense in that context. But if we recognize, it's imagery. God's showing them the behaviors and making comparisons that the people will understand. It's not a literal, this is what's going to happen. Jerusalem is going to be compared to Samaria and Sodom. Okay, keep in mind, what are we talking about? Well, Samaria, that northern portion of Israel, the northern kingdom, if you will, and a little bit beyond. And depending on how literal you want to get, okay, it's intended to be, I think, the northern kingdom. And then Sodom, okay. That one of the Bible stories everybody knows, Sodom and Gomorrah, whether you were a quote-unquote religious person or not. There's just that imagery that even in society is recognized. Sodom was a very wicked city. You know, the people of Sodom. See, there's that imagery. The city itself is stones and bricks. Okay? It's neutral. But the people of Sodom were very wicked. Okay? So picking up in verse 46, your older sister was Samaria, who lived to the north of you with her daughters, and your younger sister, who lived to the south of you with her daughters, was Sodom. Jerusalem followed in the sins of her sisters and went further. Verse 47, you not only followed their ways and copied their detestable practices, but in all your ways you soon became more depraved than they. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, your sister Sodom, say that 10 times fast. Your sister Sodom and her daughters never did what you and your daughters have done. Down to verse 51. Samaria did not commit half the sins you did. You have done more detestable things than they, and have made your sisters seem righteous by all these things you have done. And again, if we remember the history of both the northern kingdom, the story of Sodom, God's saying they were bad. Okay? You saw what happened. You saw their defeats. Remember, those in the north went into defeated first by the Assyrians and taken away. And yet you were even worse. Go ahead, Matt.
Why do you think they said, this may sound like a simple question, but why do you think visually they refer
as sisters. But going back, the whole allegory, the whole parable of the bride, God is the husband. I mean, it's simple, we got to have a bride. So there's got to be one on the other side. But that's the imagery of Israel as a woman, as God's chosen people as the bride is consistent throughout.
Okay, but he considered Sodom his sister, like it was a girl.
Imagery, they're all his children, if you want to think of it that way.
Okay.
And he's relating them, go, here's your sister up here, here's your sister down there. Could have said brother, really, for the imagery, it wouldn't make any difference in the world.
I think in some ways, I think of it as, when you say it, the first thing that came to my mind was like a woman, she can thrive and bear much, or she could be, or she could be not well
Mm-hmm.
and not deliver anything. I guess so.
No, I mean, you could take imagery further. This doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah. It says they were unfaithful. Both.
That's why I was just inquisitive.
Yeah. And that's where, again, don't lose sight of the central points. Okay. You were chosen by God, brought into a special relationship that you as a people rejected. Now, you follow the ways of those around you that also knew of God, but chose not to follow either. Now, in this special relationship, you had the opportunity to be an example, to draw people to God, which they didn't do. They proved. Yeah. And so their punishment, their rejection of God leads to the consequences, the punishment of that rejection, of that breaking of covenant. Imagery. Yeah. As long as they keep the thread. Okay. You can let your mind wander. I assure you, there's nights at home I'm sitting there going in all kinds of strange places. And trying, what are they trying to say? What are they trying to do? Because, again, this one, the next part is really the odd part. That if you want to go nuts, though, you can. Because he talks about restoring the fortunes of Sodom and Samaria. Verses 53 to 58, that they're going to be brought back. Well, we know those kingdoms are not reestablished. That city of Sodom is not reestablished, okay, historically. So trying to make that connection just doesn't work because this is imagery. This is the story he's using to convey the illustration of their sins. The point being, if he's going to restore Jerusalem, there's got to be some equity. If you are so bad, and I'm going to bring you back, well, the others may feel some benefit too. Again, in the imagery, the story of it. The point being, that contrast of those two groups, if you will, those two sisters, is to say how bad you were. Are you recognizing your guilt? Are you feeling your guilt for the rejection? And these are two groups. Now again, we kind of slip back into, historical comparison. Israel would have looked down on, okay? Would have felt superior to. And think about, in the context for those in Jerusalem, Judah and Benjamin, when their northern family, quote unquote, were defeated. Okay? See, you all were not faithful to God. And now they're gone. But you were just as bad or worse. Again, to try to get them to recognize what's going on. Because the punishment, and it's very clear, look at verse 59. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I will deal with you as you deserve, because you have despised my oath by breaking the covenant. Again, we've talked about this several times in other classes, that they had the opportunity to be in a right relationship. They knew how to follow God. They knew what was required, expected of them, and they chose to reject it. So that's why this is coming again. You've got to keep pulling these threads together. This message to the people in exile. Understand why this is happening. Understand why this is happening. It's not just God being mean and wrathful. It's God finally being distraught over the broken relationship, the broken covenant for decades, for hundreds of years, and saying, this is it. This is the time of destruction. And again, we've already seen the thinking, this doesn't happen. We hear these prophecies and there's no results, there's no consequences. God's words will be true. They will be fulfilled and they will know. We're going to see a shift in Ezekiel in just a couple of weeks. This is all coming. Destruction is coming. And then it's going to happen. And then word will come to those in exile, it's been destroyed. And and then those other exiles will be with him. So it's coming. Then he gets to close, and you have that hope of reconciliation, or that message of reconciliation. After this vivid display of Israel's sin, the imagery of breaking the covenants, the message of hope. So despite the certainty of judgment, God would not forget the covenant with Israel. Think of it in verse 60. Yet I will remember the covenant I made with you in the days of your youth, and I will establish an everlasting covenant with you. It is repeated for emphasis. So I will establish my covenant with you, and you will know that I am the Lord. This is probably one of the most important points. If you don't remember much else today, remember this one. Okay? God will make atonement. Verse 63. Then when I make atonement for you for all you have done, you will remember and be ashamed, and never again open your mouth because of your humiliation, declares the sovereign Lord. I will make atonement for you. Lee, I think that's foreshadowing. I think that's foreshadowing. Okay? So even we today can understand the covenant God has established with his people now, with the Christians. He's made atonement for us.
Kind of two things on this imagery here, just a shameless plug for the Revelation class on Wednesday night. In chapter 12, there is a woman, a beautiful woman that's adorned with the stars of heaven, and then she is with child, gives birth. Satan tries to kill the child, and he can't, so God protects the woman, and then Satan makes war against the rest of her children. That's the same covenant woman. But when we see her there in Revelation 12, she's the forgiven one.
Okay.
She gives birth to Jesus because God kept Judah together until Messiah came. And so that same imagery of a covenant, she's now in the everlasting covenant in Revelation. But back to another imagery is the account of the adulterous woman in John chapter 8. What was the command? I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. She's caught in the very act. Go and sin no more. And that was what Judah was told coming out of exile.
And they would learn, it's in the context of idolatry, would learn the lesson. We don't see that in their history moving forward. They accepted that. There's all kinds of other problems we can deal with in other classes. But God working for his people. This is his history. He providing for his children. Across times, across the covenants, the two covenants. Said, you are mine. And the choice we have to accept or reject. Now, come back to what we talked about at the very beginning class earlier. I said we need to hold on to this idea because we're going to come back to it. Their unfaithfulness, okay, their wickedness, the imagery of the prostitution, of going after the nations, their shrines, sacrificing to other gods, to idols. Okay? If you got to sum it up in a word, okay, the problem that God is dealing with is their idolatry. Okay, their idolatry. I think the challenge this creates sometimes for us is that word. That's a very good religious term, or if you will, biblical word. Because outside of this kind of space, or perhaps in conversations with other Christians, when do you hear that word? Or better yet, when do you think of that concept? So here's the easy question. What does that really mean to you? It could be literal if you were living in the time of Ezekiel's folks. Well, do you have a wooden figure or a golden figure or a silver figure? I'm going to guess if I were to come into everybody's house, I'm probably not going to see a little shrine to Ashtoreth or Tammuz or Baal or those kind of things. John?
I was going to say, in today's terms, it could be anything or, persons or entity that we put our faith and our trust and our hope in for our continued existence, our survival, our prosperity.
Remember the graphic imagery of this chapter. Go ahead, Marilyn.
What I focus
What I focus on?
every
I needed another word there, yeah.
What do I spend my time learning?
Okay.
Is it God in my relationship with Him, in my growth
Mhm.
every day? You know, am I growing closer to Him today than I was yesterday, or a week ago, or a month ago, or am I still wobbling along the same? What I spend my time on my thoughts tell what I think is important and who I am.
That's right. It's actually a very simple concept to grasp, to understand the problem. I did a little bit of reading on the idea and found consistently the same type of wording. I think most people borrow from someone. That was a good point, so I'll just repeat it. The thing, and you've said it in both John and Marilyn's comments, the thing or the person loved more than God, wanted more than God, desired more than God, treasured more than God, enjoyed more than God, trusted in more than God, anything, anyone that becomes more important to you than God. And not always in a conscious way, or a top-of-mind way, as I would say in a marketing parlance.
We could have somebody come in and audit us, look at our bank statements, look at our house and the things we own, look at what we talk about, look at the time spent during the week, during the month, and we would get a report that would probably scare us.
Probably.
Yeah, I find it very easily in my own life that I've had God like literally, say, hey, why are you dwelling on this when I'm right here?
Yeah.
And I have to say, it's not. It's a hard. It's a slippery slope
Mm-hmm.
because we as humans have these wants, needs, desires, and thing that usually stimulates the most, we give the most attention to. That's what blooms from addiction. So how easy it is to slide into those things, and then
Sure.
ignore that because you're getting more stimuli from that versus this. So it's a slippery slope, and so it takes purpose, it takes focus.
Yeah. I'm going to comment now. Let me get the next one. We're going to keep coming back to the idea. That book is really quite interesting. The practice of the presence of God. Still trying to figure out how to work it in this thing. We're going to keep coming back week in and week out. You're going to keep hearing it because you're stuck with me for a few more weeks. Not just your prayer life with God, but your life with God. And the extent to which you are talking to God, bringing Him into everything. It was kind of silly in my mind, I'm talking to God. Nothing silly about it. Not at all. Talk to it. Talk to it. Share with Him what's going on. Thank Him for what's going on. I appreciate that I can get up today. That I can walk, I can go to work. Help me in that work. Guide me through. When I'm in challenges at work, that internal conversation, awareness, mind awareness. It is kind of hard to enter into an illicit affair when I'm in the presence of the beloved. It's when I stop talking, I'm not listening, that I begin to look for other things because I feel like something's missing. What's missing is I've stopped talking. I'm beginning to drift away from the relationship.
And I think that's exactly the point, because these things that we focus on are an inadequate substitute for God. Because what God offers us is not a distant God that we, think about. It is one that when we meditate upon Him, He offers us consolation, and He offers us peace. And there's the forgiveness of sin that is involved in that peace, but also peace with others. So our anxieties and our fears and even our sinfulness, we look for another salve for those things, and they're all inadequate substitutes. It's God, where God has the rightful role of comforter and peacemaker in our life. That's when our focus is there. Everything else is an idol.
And keep that word in your head, because in part, I need to be warned. That drifting is just in that sin, put a name to it, is idolatry. And much of the Old Testament is to warn us of how God feels about idolatry. And feel, I use that term specifically, remember the nature of the relationship, the love relationship, and how much it offends and just cuts God. That we choose that which will never satisfy. A little verse in Ecclesiastes 3:11 fascinates me. He has set eternity in the hearts of men. We can't be satisfied. We can't be satisfied in anything other than God. It is not possible. Now I'll go out this week and I'll forget that at some point. Okay, it'll drift away, and then hopefully it'll come back. By staying in the presence, that satisfaction and fulfillment, even in the despicable times, the tough times, still there. Right?
I was going to say, you started the question by asking, what does this mean to us, or how often we see or view this?
Right.
We really don't. Unless it's a movie where we see some tribe worshiping a stick or gold, we don't think of idols. So I don't think this is as strong as the idolatry. The idol is something I bow to. God wants a relationship like a marriage where you're talking in the morning, you're talking in the afternoon, you're eating together, you're walking on the beach, you're going fishing. It's an intimacy.
Right.
There is no intimacy there with an idol.
Right.
So he's asking for something so much greater. And that's why you can get into the adultery, because it's not just what you worship, it's what are you intimate with, and what are you thinking about sharing on an every minute basis.
The point made a little bit earlier, in that idolatrous relationship, you're always giving, and you're never receiving. There's no fulfillment, no satisfaction.
Oh, and what's even worse is that it's fashioned with your own hands.
You choose to do it. We're nothing if not crazy. All right, we are out of time, so I'm going to real quickly just explain to you what you've got in chapter 17. I'm going to leave that with you. I'm not going to come back to chapter 17 next week. But I've laid out the outline in a very particular way, and I encourage you to read it that way. You have the imagery in the front part of the chapter, and then the explanation in the latter part. But I've grouped the verses together, each imagery element with its explanation, so that you get the point that this is about primarily Zedekiah and his unfaithfulness and God's response to that. So I'm going to leave that with you, and we will pick up beginning of chapter 18 next week.